Okay, I want to welcome you all on behalf of the UT Libraries and the UT Government Department's Texas Politics Project. It's a great pleasure for me to be involved in this project with the library. As Fred said in his introductory comments, you know, public programming is a part of a great library, and we have great libraries at UT, and it's really great to be part of this. This is part of a broader celebration connected with the unveiling of the Barbara Jordan statue, which will happen April 24th at noon, and I invite you all to be there. It's a big day in UT history and a big day in the history of the state, and I urge you all to put that on your calendar. That's April 24th at noon. I think the very fact that we are here to mark the unveiling of a statue of Barbara Jordan on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin speaks to the fact that I don't really have to use our panelists' time to introduce or give an overview of Barbara Jordan's life. I don't need to remind you who she was and what she did. Amidst these ceremonies, I suspect she would remind us there's still work to be done to address a lot of the problems she worked on so hard in her life, and I would have to agree with her on that. But I do think that the fact of this recognition for Barbara Jordan means that when she spoke, people did listen. So I'm foregoing a long introduction in the hope that everyone in the room knows the basic facts of Barbara Jordan's life and her public service, and we can get to letting our guests shed some new light on who Barbara Jordan was and on her lasting impact. Each of our guests could receive a very long introduction, but I'm going to try to keep it very brief in order to allow for maximum time to actually hear from them rather than about them. To my immediate left, Susan K. Rieff was named Executive Director of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in July 2004. Before that, she served as Policy Director for Land Stewardship for the National Wildlife Federation, as Deputy Chief of Staff for the U.S. Department of Interior during part of the Clinton administration, and as Policy Council Director and Director of Environmental Policy for Governor Ann Richards. She is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Texas Christian University with a degree in Environmental Sciences, and holds a Master of Public Affairs degree from the LBJ School here at the University of Texas, where she was a student of Barbara Jordan's. And we're looking forward to hearing about that. Next to Susan is Max Sherman. Max Sherman was Dean of the LBJ School from July 1983 until September of 1997. Prior to his appointment at the LBJ School, he was Special Counsel to the Governor of Texas. From 1971 to 1977, he served in the Texas Senate representing District 31, Amarillo, it's the heart of that district, leaving in 1977 to become the president of West Texas University, or West Texas State University, pardon me. He has a JD degree from the University of Texas at Austin and a BA in history from Baylor University. I had the pleasure of working with Max on the DVD that accompanied the volume of Barbara Jordan's speeches that Max edited from the UT Press, which has been very successful. That's called Barbara Jordan, Speaking the Truth with Eloquent Thunder. I'm actually going to raise it up so that we have a, there we go. And I'm very happy to be working with Max again. So with that, I really want to start with one question for y'all. You know, and it's one that I expect is both historical and personal for both of you, and that is, you know, what are we remembering with the statue of Barbara Jordan?
Well, I think we are remembering, first of all, the power of her personality and the dramatic and important role that she played in so many ways, both at the state level, in the state Senate, where she served with Max, and then, as most people remember it, her role during Watergate hearings and the clarity and the honesty and the rigor that she brought to that process. I think she will always be associated in people's minds with that. And while she had been only a short time in the Congress, that impact was astonishing. I think we remember just the person of Barbara Jordan. And as we'll probably get into later, that person didn't waver much over the years. She had many different jobs, but wherever she went, she was Barbara Jordan. And I think there are few politicians, I think there are few people that can equal her in that respect. Certainly there were all the firsts, and people remember all the first that she was. but just her person was just different and remarkable and memorable. And I think the statue is going to be great because it will remind people of that.
Jim, I think that Susan was a student of Barbara's, and I think that if you went out to her gravestone at the state cemetery and you looked at the back of the gravestone, which is a tall gravestone, there's only one word written there, and that word is teacher. Here's someone that came to the Texas Senate when there were many people there who were not happy for her to be there. She was a black woman, and both of those names made it unpopular for her. There were people who used derogatory references to her when she came as a young 30-year-old state senator. But at the end of that term, she was voted the outstanding freshman senator by many of those old curmudgeons that did not want her there. And then, of course, she goes to Congress and moved to the center of the national stage when she gave her Watergate remarks, and we'll talk about more of those things as we go through it. But I think it's just extremely important that, that there is a statute recognizing her at the University of Texas at Austin, because those students are really, in fact, this book is dedicated to Barbara Jordan's students. That's the reason for it, and her, I think, most challenging role was to be a teacher and a meaningful teacher. And if you remember history, another very distinguished American was remembered as an educator, and that was Thomas Jefferson, because on his gravestone he has two things. One, he was the author of the Articles of Religious Freedom for the state of Virginia, and that he was the founder of the University of Virginia. So Barbara Jordan really looking and being noted as a teacher, and to have a statue on the campus of the University of Texas is very, if I could just add one little note, the book is something that's only intended for Barbara's student. It's taken on a life, but I spoke to a Rotary Club in a very conservative area once, and a young man stayed later because he wasn't sure what he would tell me. But as you may know, the airport terminal is named the Barbara Jordan Terminal, and there is a statue of Barbara Jordan, which was originally to be on the second floor, which is down close to the baggage claim area because of security reasons. And the young man told me that as he came in one evening getting his luggage, he looked over and a young African-American little boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, went over to kiss the feet of Barbara Jordan.
Susan, talk to me a little bit about what you remember about meeting her and how you met her.
I had the great luck to be a student, a first-year student at the LBJ School in 1978. And Barbara retired from the Congress that year and became a professor at the LBJ School in January of '79. She taught a course that semester, and then I took that course in the fall. So I guess I was actually in the second course that she taught. And it was very difficult to get in. This was a very small seminar. I think 12 students were allowed to take her course. Of course, everyone wanted to take this course. And we had it in a small conference room, so it was a very intimate kind of gathering. And most of us, and I would say especially the students who were from Texas and from Houston, who really had witnessed her career to date, but all of us certainly knew who she was and what she had accomplished. We're sort of intimidated by this, as you might imagine, and that was even more so because she did have that voice. And anyone who ever suggests that that voice was only her speech voice never spent any time with her. That's always what she sounded like. And so to be in a small room as a first-year graduate student, or second year by then, with Barbara Jordan was a powerful and at times challenging experience. But she very quickly endeared herself to everyone, all the students, made us feel comfortable, but never too comfortable. I remember one time a student coming in late. This was a class on ethics in the public sector. And Barbara sort of disapprovingly watched as the student walked in and took their seat, and she said, "The first rule of ethics is to be on time." which kind of took care of that for the rest of the semester. But it was an amazing experience, and I think while we all the alumni or the graduates from her class over the many years that she taught could tell you, they could remember a lot of the things that they studied and a lot of the things that class was about. But I think to a person, most people would say that the education from that class was about being in her presence, was about just listening to Barbara and having a kind of Socratic engagement with her, which was the way she taught the class. And I don't think anyone who took it was not moved by it, was not influenced by it, and doesn't just remember it as this incredibly privileged opportunity that they had to spend 3 hours a week for several months with Barbara Jordan.
Now, you started your relationship with her as a student, but you guys became friends. Talk a little bit about how that happened, if you will.
Well, Barbara was very accessible to her students. I mean, you would think that that might not be the case, but Max can verify this. She knew everyone. At the end of the year, she would have a big party at her home, which would go on into the wee hours of the night. And, you know, everyone loved that. I can't describe exactly why we became such good friends, but we did. And I, over the years, traveled with her. When I lived in Washington, I would sometimes help out when she came to Washington with logistics and just company, I guess. I would do a little research for her from time to time, but mostly we were friends. I had to sort of speak to this image of Barbara, I think, and Max will certainly speak to this, I'm sure. Barbara Jordan was a hell of a lot of fun. She was a big personality. She was a great storyteller. A lot of people would think of her as this sort of somber, you know, speech maker, and she certainly could do that. And she could certainly cut you off quickly with that great voice. But she was a joyful person who loved to tell a story, who loved to hear a good joke, and music was a significant part of her life. All of her sisters, both of her sisters, were music teachers in Houston, public school music teacher. And they all sang together. And at the student parties and others, she would be leading the music, the sing-alongs with the music. And she played guitar. In her later years, she wasn't able to do that, but she had a big voice and loved to sing and loved to tell other people to sing and how to sing and what to sing. So that was a common thing that we had. We were friends, and I got to share with her some wonderful trips, wonderful music, the appearances of surprising people who would turn up at her home. A.Z. Taylor Morton was a very good friend of Barbara's, and A.Z. was, as you know, the Treasurer of the United States in the Carter administration. And one New Year's Eve, I was at Barbara's house with a few other friends, and A.Z. walked in, and she had with her a friend who was some sort of royal chief in Africa, and he was in full regalia. And so he comes in, and we, you know, continued the party, and he contributed to that. So we became friends, I think, because of our, you know, my affinity for what she was teaching, my interest sort of in her story. I've often thought, in a way, it might have been easier for me to become a friend of Barbara's because not having grown up in Texas, I didn't have quite the level of intimidation, maybe, or understanding that some of my classmates did. But how do friendships develop, I'm not sure exactly.
It is interesting to look at the biographical materials. You know, there's a couple of different biographies, obviously, but there's one from the late 70s that's kind of that she wrote with a novelist that she contributed. Right. You know, and that really comes out in that book, the notion that she was really, in her private life, very fun.
Jim, can I make a...
Please do.
In the book, I wish it were on a screen that you could see it. Here's a picture with her with Bernard Rappaport, who's a former chairman of the Board of Regents at UT, at a women's basketball game. And she has her hands up in the air and is smiling and laughing. And she was the honorary coach of the women's basketball team here at the University of Texas. And this is the only photograph in here that's come from our family collection. And it's a picture that was taken when I came to the Senate. And Barbara had already been there 2 sessions. And we're out at a retreat center. And there are a lot of children. Charlie Wilson, who's Charlie Wilson's Wars, you've all heard about. He's the young senator there, and he's in there. But there's Barbara playing the guitar. Our children were 6 and 4 at that time, and they fell in love with Barbara Jordan. And it's because she would go out and she would skeet. She could drink. She could cuss. You know, she could do it all, and she loved life. If I could tell a story that just, because when I came to the Senate, we're close to the same age, but she was already a veteran, and she served one more session, my first one. And we had 12 of 13 committee assignments the same. But there couldn't be 2 districts more different. I represent the panhandle of Texas, which is agriculture, 50 miles between towns. And she represents the 5th Ward of Houston, where people are very close together, very different economy. And yet we became the closest of friends. And she happened to be on the agricultural committee. Why, I don't know. She had no interest in agriculture. And some of my constituents in 5 of my 20 counties wanted me to introduce a bill dealing with the hunting of deer with dogs. Now, don't ask me more about it, I don't remember. But anyway, they wanted either to do it or not do it, I don't remember. So I had this bill, and I was new, and I wanted to serve my constituents, and I had the bill to bring up, and she says, this, Susan says in this, Max, I think you should put that bill in a subcommittee. I said, no, Barbara, I need to pass this bill. Max, you should put that bill in the subcommittee. I kept pushing. She says, Max, more people have been defeated in this body for a game bill than any other vote they've ever cast. Put the bill in a subcommittee. And you know where it is today? Still in the subcommittee. And I got reelected a couple, 3 times after that. But she was looking after my interest, and we had just become friends. Can I tell one other story briefly? Because we became very close friends in that time, but it was at a time, and I'm sorry that Representative Thompson's not here yet, but in the Senate, at that time, they didn't post the bills. So you had no idea what was being discussed unless you paid very close attention. And so I developed a system. I'm a young lawyer and gung-ho to go, and I had a system with pros and cons of the bills that my staff had put together. So if Fred brought up a bill, I would kind of know a little bit about it. And toward the end of the session, she's sitting from about here to the corner, maybe, and there are 15 on this side of the Senate, 16 on this side, and I'm 3 chairs back. And I have no idea what she's doing. And it's what in the Senate we call mumbling a bill through. And so instead of going to the chair, I just went down and I said, Barbara, I can't hear you. She kind of narrowed her eyes and she says, Max, you'll hear me when I want you to hear me. And I told my children, I voted for that bill. I have no idea what it did. I have no idea what it cost. But she had that power.
Let me ask you a little bit, since you're talking about the Senate, I do want to talk a little bit about what it was like when she was there and how she negotiated that. Because when you look back at her legislative career, it's very skillful and very pragmatic. And it's one of the things that's really striking to me about her, in the sense that as time goes on, we remember her more and more as a kind of progressive icon in a lot of ways. And yet she was a very pragmatic legislator, wasn't she?
I think I only served 1 session with her, but I think that from what other people tell you is that she really learned the Senate as a club. And she learned that you needed to be a member of the club, and she became one. But when they were trying to pass the first sales tax, this was before I got there, but she and another group of so-called more liberal senators determined that the sales tax was going to pass, but that it ought not to be on food and drugs. And so they led a filibuster, and they were able to keep it from being put on food and drugs. And she was able to do that, and I think maybe something that's out of the Senate that tells more about how pragmatic she was is that when John Connally was being tried in Washington on the milk scandal cases, most people think that her testimony is responsible for his being acquitted. The jury was about 8-4 African-American Anglo, and she testified in support of John Connally. Many people in the black community did not favor her doing that, but she said Governor Connally had treated her fairly, had helped her to be successful in her role, and she was going to go and tell what she knew about him, and she did, and then when the verdict came in, he was acquitted. And it tells a very practical reason, but for practical reasons that she felt comfortable with.
Well, she testified as a character witness, as I recall. It was really, I mean, it wasn't dispositive of the case itself. They asked her to testify as a character witness, and in fact, she had lots of objections. I mean, Connally's record on a lot of her issues was not only weak, but terrible in a lot of ways. And I think she had written about how she found it offensive and yet thought it was the right thing to do. Yeah.
I think but I think it shows how she was able to, and there were times she would support the chair on issues where, because the chair really determines your fate, whether you get to chair a committee, what committees you're on. And so she tried to work with the leadership, but only up to a point. If they crossed the line of supporting something she really felt was not in the public best interest, then she would oppose them, and did that very, very skillfully.
How do you think she felt about, I mean, I think it's always interesting to wonder about how a person that's seen as historic in this way thinks about their public persona versus who they are privately. How did you get a sense, I mean, you talked about, how she was always present in a certain way, but how did she think about that?
I think Barbara Jordan was one of the most, a very interesting part of her character is that I don't think she was any different externally, in the public world than she was privately in many ways. She knew who she was, and all of that was all of one piece. As Max says, she was very pragmatic about things. She had a core of principles. She had a core of values about public service, about what it meant to be in elective office, and she didn't waver from those. But she also knew that to get things done, you especially in a legislative situation, you made friends and you made compromises. But she was the same. She was the same at home. I mean, clearly she might be more, candid about some things than she might be publicly, but she was the same person, and she was not like anyone else that I've ever known in that way. She was very comfortable, I guess, at some point in her life, or maybe throughout her life, she became who she was. I remember once asking her sisters, how did she learn to talk like that? Because you all don't talk like that. And they were older than she, and they said, we don't know, she's always been like that. Where'd she come from?
Right.
You have to look, I think, at her life story. And to me, the book that Mary Beth Rogers wrote of her is the definitive one. And it pulls together all the stories that, of course, Max and I heard, just being a friend and in her home a lot and traveling with her. It's kind of an amazing story in that way. But she, all the things that she taught in ethics class to LBJ school students were the same ideas that you saw expressed in the way she lived and the way she was with her friends. She was very, in my experience, very unique in that way. Max,
I think Susan's put her finger on it. I think she was who she was, and she was comfortable with who she was. And something I didn't know when we did the book, but her speech to the Democratic Convention in 1976 and her Watergate speech are two that are highly recognized. But when I did the book, I was not aware of a study that was done by the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And they had 135 scholars to rank the top 100 speeches of the 20th century. Excuse me, and to my amazement, the 1976 speech is ranked higher than the Watergate speech. It's number 5. Would you guess number 1 is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream? Number 2 is Kennedy's inaugural. Number 3 is Franklin Roosevelt's first inaugural. Number 4 is Franklin Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor, and that speech is 5. Watergate is 13. So 2 of the 15 top speeches of 100 years are speeches of Barbara Jordan. And I think in each instance she gave them, what she was really doing was saying what she felt needed to be said at that occasion, and it touched the hearts of everyone. I'll get my voice back and I want to tell a story, but I'm going to let someone else. You know, tell my story.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I got my voice back.
Okay, good.
Because I think it's a story that I was asked to be one of the speakers when the New York City University dedicated the annual review of the law to her. And the other speakers were John Bradimus, and the other was Peter Rodino, who was chairman of the Watergate Committee. But the story is not related to the event, because my brother-in-law and his wife live in New York City. We visit them, and we had plans to go to a restaurant. I would call it Ben & Jerry's is the ice cream, but it was 2 names like that in Soho. And we had reservations to meet them. And so the traveling aide that was with her, after I had spoken, I went over and was talking to her, and I said, well, where are they taking you to dinner this evening? And she said, well, we're going back to the hotel and have sandwiches. They had made no plans. So I said, well, my goodness. So I said, why don't you join us and I'll call my brother-in-law and see if this can be done. So to make a long story short, I called him and said, and be bold enough to tell them that the guest we want to have is Barbara Jordan, and she's in a wheelchair, and she has a traveling companion. So we've got to have 2 places, and if you know those little New York City restaurants are only about half this room, and they're all stacked with chairs. But in the meantime, while we made the arrangements or called in, they moved everything to allow the wheelchair to go in, and they'd gotten a ramp to put in there. So everyone in the restaurant, maybe 100, 150 people, knew who was coming. And when we came in, we took a cab over. They had a van for her in the wheelchair. And we see this very elegantly dressed black gentleman, and he's waiting, he's heard. And when they get out, these are stories I don't tell very often. Yeah. And he's standing there waiting to talk to Barbara Jordan. And they have a visit there that last and last and last. They had never met until that time on the street. Very, very powerful. And when we went in, everyone in there knew she was there. Everyone knew Barbara Jordan was there. Presence.
Right.
Presence.
I want to talk a little bit about, how she viewed herself in the trajectory of kind of the African-American politics in the United States, because she came at a very interesting time. I mean, the year that she was elected to the House was also the year of a lot of mobilization of black nationalist politics in Houston. It was the year that Leland and Washington and the People's Four got elected. It was the year Miss Thompson got elected from kind of even a different kind of approach. Did she talk much about that? How did she view that, the milieu then? I mean, how do you think that had an impact on her? Because it was it was very complicated.
I've got one quick comment to make about that I think is relevant to probably a better story that Max can tell. And it kind of goes back to our earlier discussion. Barbara Jordan did not identify herself with any one group. And during that time, increasingly, she was being called an African American, the first African American to do this or that. And she objected to that because she said, I am not a hyphenated American. I am an American. I am a member of Congress. I am these things, but I am a woman. I am a black person. I am a member of Congress. I am a Texan. I am this, but I am not a hyphenated American. She saw that as a diminishment of what it meant to be an American.
One time Bill Hobby introduced her as Congresswoman Jordan, and she took him to task. She says, the term that's used for calling members of Congress is congressman. She says, I am a congressman. And so he said he never did that again. You know, so she was who she was, and she felt very, very comfortable in doing that.
Well, it was interesting. I mean, it's too bad that the Representative Thompson is in committee, because I spoke with her. You know, I sat and talked to her a little bit yesterday because I was at the Capitol, and one of the first things she said when I kind of talked about how we were going to open with kind of a general view of her in the way that we did was that she really thought that she was colorblind. And I was struck by, you know, that's come to be such a powerful cultural construct, but that that was very tricky in the late 60s and early 70s in a way that it's not now, or that the trickiness of it has changed. Because at a time of kind of mobilization in Black consciousness, being colorblind in some ways could be seen as not really being where, you know, some sector of the Black community was at that point.
There's one area where I think it shows up where she was very conscious of the path that she had followed in her own life, and that's when she testified against the confirmation of Robert Bork to be appointed to the Supreme Court. And she says, I don't come here just as a follower, which means just as a Democrat, but I come here from my own experience. And it's a very brief statement, actually. But if you know, she went to segregated public schools in Houston, segregated Texas Southern, went off to Boston University to get a law degree, came back and couldn't get a job because she was Black and because she was a woman in Houston, started practicing law at the kitchen table of her parents. And then she ran for Congress, ran for the State House in an at-large district, which was designed after the Civil War. And she got 44,000 votes and was not elected in an at-large system. And then 2 years later, she ran again, got 64,000 votes, not elected in an at-large system. I always point out that she got more votes not to be elected to the House of Representatives than I got to be elected to the Texas Senate in the Texas Panhandle. And then redistricting comes along with Baker versus Carr, and you get one person, one vote in redistricting, so she goes to the Senate. And she says, but if Robert Bork, who had written speeches and written articles, made speeches and written articles saying that Baker versus Carr was wrongly decided, and he also said that the decision that said the poll tax was unconstitutional was wrongly decided, she said if his philosophy had been prevalent on the court, I would still be running for the Texas House of Representatives for the 11th time and still unsuccessfully. And so she led the fight for him not to be confirmed.
But she was also, I mean, you know, to use a phrase that's now used in a very different, or figure of speech is now used in a very different way, there was an element of what we would now call the maverick about her, right? In that during the Clinton administration, you know, she took what was a very unpopular stand on immigration, yes. Right?
I think that's telling about her also, even after she was out of the Congress and teaching here at the LBJ School. She continued to serve in on some very difficult projects, and that had to be one of them. She was active with the Kaiser Family Health Foundation and some other things. I mean, continuing working in those areas that she thought were so important. But when she agreed to take on the National Commission on Immigration, I think she knew that that would be one of the most challenging things she tried to do. And I'm sure I was not involved in that, although I would see her occasionally when she came to town. She approached it with a very in a very lawyerly way, I believe, collecting evidence, weighing that evidence. I don't think she entered that job, and she would have thought of it as a job, with a predetermined agenda. Certainly, she brought her own experience to bear on it, but you know, with little public recognition of what that took, particularly given how difficult it was by then for her to travel. She devoted a great deal of time and energy to that, and I think her feeling would have been, let the political chips sort of fall where they may. Max, do you have a...
Oh, I think, to me, one of the things that I'm sorry in the book is that Daniel and I, we were not able to find, even though she says they were glad they were recording her testimony on immigration, and so it's not in her words in here, you just have the text. But in many ways, she led a committee that had 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats, and she's the chair, to unanimously make recommendations on immigration. It talks about pragmatism. She was able to bring people together. I've always said it, I think it still may be the solution to a very difficult issue today. She didn't live to see the final report. She died before that, but the work is much there, and it has some controversial issues. But one of the cores of it, for example, is if you had an identification card that worked, and she said that if you had that, it's almost the beginning of a solution to the issues as you move through it. But I think the most important thing is that she took people from both parties appointed by the Senate and the House and got them to unanimously make a recommendation.
Yeah, I want to open it for questions in a minute, but I guess really the final thing to talk about is, you know, we've touched, as we've talked about these things, on a lot of, you know, the numerous things that she was engaged with professionally as a person. What do you think her ambition was? What did she, you know, what was she trying to do?
I think she felt like she was going to make a big impact on the world. And I say that not because she said that, but because, especially if you read the early biographies, she knew she was special. She knew who she was, and she knew that she was unusual, and I think she felt an obligation to use that personal power. Who's to say what she might have done had her health not been an issue? I think what is another powerful thing about her is the grace that she displayed in moving on. When it became difficult probably to be in the Congress, she could have continued, but she made the choice affirmatively to come here and teach, and then embrace that with complete enthusiasm. I remember a situation or two when some famous person, in fact Max and I were talking about one this morning, we'll not name that person, showed up at the LBJ school during one of her classes and expected, I'm sure, for her to run out, and she made them wait until class was over because what she was doing was the important thing. What would she have done? I don't know, but she, you know, whatever she did became as important as she was.
I think, I know you've got to get to questions, just very briefly, I think she was a miffed at President Carter. I think she really aspired to be Attorney General of the United States. And he had already determined that he would appoint Griffin Bell from Georgia, who was a very distinguished judge and a very, very eminent Attorney General. And I think she was disappointed. I also think that had he appointed her, he might have been reelected. I mean, that's a gratuitous comment. But then I think later, and Susan and I talked about this, is that President Clinton, through Governor Richards, contacted her to see if he could talk with her about maybe being considered to be appointed to the Supreme Court. But again, she knew her health, and she felt that she might not live that long, and that it would be a brutal confirmation hearing, and then they might have to do it again for someone else. So she said that she would not go forward with it. And then just 2 things about her legacy. Any of you that heard the debate before the Texas primary this year, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton both referred to Barbara Jordan as their hero. And Barack Obama quoted the line from her speech at the commencement at Harvard University, said, "What the American people want is simple. They want an America as good as its promise." So the 2 leading candidates both looked to her as one of the influential forces in their lives.
I've got 2 short
Please.
things I'd like to add. One of the many roles that she accepted was a request from Governor Ann Richards to serve as her ethics advisor for the new administration. And I was on Governor Richards' staff at the time, and in part because of my relationship with Barbara, I had the occasion to take some of the people that Ann was going to appoint out to see Barbara Jordan. And it was very interesting and very telling, because some of these were quite distinguished and accomplished people. But they, like school children almost, had to go out to Barbara's house and be vetted be instructed and be tested on their ethics as that would apply to the job in Ann's administration, in Governor Richards' administration. And once or twice, I mean, I would sometimes be hanging out in the room and sometimes not, but it was, I thought it was wonderful that Governor Richards had established that post. I think a lot of people thought that that was just a kind of a press event and not very meaningful, but I can tell you that for the people that sort of had to go and prove themselves worthy and discuss their ethical orientation and what that meant for public service and the job that they were going to do, it was not a photo op kind of thing at all.
So yeah, I have to ask
Yeah,
you,
it's
tell us a
great.
little bit more about how that happened. So the person walks in the room and she asks them
Hey, Barbara,
philosophical questions, or
Oh,
she asks them,
she
she goes
would-
through their file, or both? Or?
No, she wouldn't go through a file. It was a more informal conversation than that. And some of the people she knew, and some she didn't. You know, various levels. But she would sort of tell them what was expected of them in this administration. The Richards administration was kind of, I mean, I'm biased. I worked in it, but it was kind of a breath of fresh air. It was to be different. Governor Richards was trying to lay out more transparency in government, more government that was, you know, serving the people. And that was part of the, that was the story. And Barbara would discuss with them what that meant, what the expectations would be, and schooled them, if you will, in ethics.
And, you know, she distilled ethics down
Yeah.
because there are 3 prongs. She said ethics is not complicated. She says ethics is telling the truth, being honest, and doing what you said you're going to do.
And being on time.
In no time. And I heard her use that with the first class of leadership Texas when she got jostled all these women who were in the very first class, and they were all about 20 minutes late, and she said, you know, the first ethical decision you will make is to be on time. And they're all sitting there, oh my gosh, you know. But she said it's about relationships. Ethics is about relationships. If I keep you waiting, it says I'm more important than you are. If I take a call to keep you sitting as a student, my time is more valuable than yours. So it's basic ethics is on what she was consistent in that regard.
She was.
And how did the appointees take that?
Humbly.
Some better than others, I suspect.
Some better than others, but I think most of them probably enjoyed the process.
That's great. Thank you, guys. I want to open it for questions. We got a little bit of time. We're going to bring around a microphone, so please, somebody raise a hand.
Hey, I grew up in Austin, and I was lucky enough to fly in last night. Came in through the airport. There's a lot of historic representation there to welcome you back home. There's Willie, there's Stevie Ray, but it wasn't until I got down to Barbara's statue that I really felt like I was back home.
Oh, that's
know.
great.
I sort of wonder why she's down at baggage claim and not up there back.
That's an excellent question.
She's supposed to be up on the upper floor, but it's the
supposed to be up
security reasons. I think that eventually there's supposed to be about 18 etched glass windows with quotations of Barbara Jordan's speeches, and eventually I think that still might happen. And
Well,
that you
let's
would
see.
even be welcomed back more gloriously with all the references to her.
In honesty, it's a magnificent piece, and it never fails to move me every time I come back home.
That's great.
What else? Over here.
Hi. I have a question about how Barbara Jordan was in her waning years. I know she had a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. And you talk about her gregarious personality. How was she after the diagnosis? Was she still that gregarious person, or did she change?
She actually probably knew that she had something, even in 1976, when she gave, I have a friend who was at the back of when she gave that speech that's rated number 5 in this century. And even then she had some tremors before she went up. So I think even the beginning of it, so almost all the time that we knew her, she had to live with knowing that there were illnesses, and she had many others.
Yeah.
When she died, I think the first press release indicates you know, a whole host of illnesses that she had overcome. If I could just take one moment, Susan can elaborate, but you mentioned at the end of the year she'd have all of her students down. And she did this every year. At the end of a year, all of her students would come down, and as a dean, I got to be invited. But I was
It wasn't about you.
It wasn't about me at all. But she had a little motor cart out there at her house, and she would run around that cart and the students, and she would be around in all their gatherings. It never affected her. It obviously had some effect on her, but for what she could see, she enjoyed her life, and I don't think it ever held her back.
I agree. I was lucky to take some trips with her. She served on a few corporate boards later in her life, and one of them was Burlington Northern, the train company. And Burlington Northern outfitted a car that is a thing to behold just for her and named it the River Jordan. And we took that special train from Seattle all the way across the Great Plains to Chicago one year. And it was outfitted just for her. It had all the kind of extra handholds and things that she needed. And she loved that. She got to see the West from, you know, right there without, you know, despite her disability at the time. Other trips, she loved it, and she never let it really hold her back. She always had aides that would help with that. One time, she was invited by her friend Ray Thornton, Ray Thornton, who had been a congressman from Arkansas, and they had been friends on the House Judiciary Committee. And he wanted her to give the commencement address at the University of Arkansas. And so why would she have gone to the University of Arkansas? But her friend asked her, and that happens to be very near where my parents live and where I grew up. And so she wanted me to come along, and I did, and they sent a plane down for her, a very small private plane. Well, these people didn't know very much about her condition, and so they hop off this private plane, and they realize they have got to carry her into the plane. There's not a ramp for a wheelchair going up into this little private jet. So these very dear guys somehow managed to just, and she was totally comfortable with that. It's like, here it is, boys. And she would tell them how to do it. She would order them in that voice, how to move her around. And so we got on the little plane and we got up there. This is telling about her too. Barbara had many, many close friends, and I don't pretend to be anything but one of several. But she decided that she would come to dinner at my parents' house. So after the speech, or the night before the speech, I guess, we load up again in my car and drive 20 miles. And my brother and his cowboy friend were there. And they also went out and hauled her out of the chair, helped her in the wheelchair, and rolled in, and she had dinner with my parents and my brother and I. And then we went back we reversed the routine, back to whatever the best hotel was at the time in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And she gave just a fantastic speech. I mean, they still talk about her commencement speech up there. So she was game. She was game for anything.
And one of the most choice jobs that any student could have would be to be the aide who would go down to get her, to bring her to class in the morning, because you had to help get her into the car, help get her out of the house, and then you'd come to this, and you had an hour going and coming with Barbara Jordan, and some of those life-changing experiences took place for those students who got to be the aide to pick her up.
Probably have time for one more if you have one.
If you don't think of a question, I might have one more story I'm going to tell.
Close us out, Max. Get us home.
Why is she buried where she is? I'll tell it very briefly. It's a longer story than your time, but I was very much involved, and I was her dean at that point. Even though she was my boss, I was her dean. And over the time when she almost drowned, I came back from my mother's and held her hand down on the gurney when they thought she wouldn't live through the night. And then I always had this instinct, and just before Christmas, before she dies in January, I have this feeling I need to go see her. And you never ask ahead. You always just showed up, and I would write 2 or 3 sentences on a card. And I was there, and when her doctor came in with some tests, and I offered to leave, she said, no, stay. So I literally was the first person other than Barbara to be there when she was told she would die in a few weeks. And so I knew that. But the reason she asked me to stay is she made me promise not to cancel her class, which was to start the 20th of January. She fully intended to be there to teach that class. So 2 or 3 weeks later, I go down to her home unannounced, and the nurses are working with her, and her 2 very close friends are there. And they said, we're glad you came. They gave me 3 assignments. And I left that day, and one was called Bill Moyers, and his epilogue, his speech is in the back of this book. And he agreed that he had given memorial whenever it took place. The other was to call her lawyer and to tell him that she's going to die. And the third was to pick a place for her to be buried, because she had no place. She fully expected to live. You think about her image. She was going to outlive God. You know, I mean, she really, but she had no place to be buried. So I did 2 things, had an appointment the next day to get a place. Nancy Earl, who was her longtime friend and companion, called me the day before, and I said, Nancy, what are we looking for in a place for her to be buried? And she says, well, you know, Barbara, it needs to be on the highest hill, and it needs to be next to Stephen F. Austin. And we laughed. And so after she dies the next morning, the very next morning, and after all this, I go with another good friend of hers, Stan McClellan, and we make this appointment at 3 the next afternoon. And the superintendent worked in the Senate when Barbara and I were there, and he called me Senator Sherman and her Senator Jordan. He said, well, Senator, the old hill has been closed for 100 years, but he said, there are 3 places that I think might work for Senator Jordan. And he had one down at the base of the hill, which was just beautiful. And I looked at the gravestones around, and they were all men of another era, very prejudiced reputations. And I said, if we put her there, she'll haunt me the rest of my life. So I said, let's look at the others. And we went to the back of the hill and looked at it. And Stan said, this is it. And I said, it may be, Stan, but let's look at the third one. We know Barbara. And so we got over there, and the superintendent said, you know, I think it's too small. And he said, Senator Jordan's a big woman. This was another time. And I said, well, you've got some guys. Let's measure it. And they measured it. He said, lo and behold, it'll work. You know where she's buried? At the top of the highest hill, cornering on Stephen F. Austin.
And with that, Max Sherman, Susan Rieff, thank you very much. Thank you all.